Before we begin, if you're listening right now, share with us. What time is it where you are? And where in the world are you listening from? Let us know in the comments. If you enjoy calming history, soft storytelling, and a bit of forgotten truth before bed, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss a sleepy journey into the past. Now settle in, take a slow breath, and let's begin. In the year 1714, under the reign of the Kangxi Emperor, the gates of the Forbidden City creaked open just past dawn. The wind carried the faint scent of camphor wood and brick dust as a cart rolled into the outer court. Inside, seated upright with her feet tucked neatly beneath her skirt, was a girl named Mei Ling. 14 years old, she had come from a middling gentry family in Suzhou. Her father, a minor prefectural official, had petitioned for her entry into the palace as a show of loyalty and ambition. She did not speak as the cart halted before the Meridian Gate. No one ever did on arrival. The silence wasn't fear, it was protocol. Silence preserved dignity. Silence was what the eunuchs expected. Mei Ling's hair had been freshly oiled and combed into 2 low loops, each secured with a carved bone pin. Her face was powdered in, white rice dust, her lips dabbed with crushed red azalea petals. The cosmetics were not for beauty, but for conformity. A concubine-to-be had to present herself like a blank canvas, soft, controlled, without story. The emperor's court would decide what story she would be allowed to live. The gates themselves, 5 arches tall and wide, were not for her. Only the emperor himself could pass through the central arch. Mei Ling was led wordlessly toward the farthest right passage. Her slippers, barely making a sound, met the vast flagstones warmed by the morning sun. And in that moment, she was no longer her father's daughter, nor a girl of Suzhou. She became one of the women of the inner court, stripped of name and place, folded into a system older than any of them. The procession of evaluation inside the outer compound, she and 5 other girls waited in a shaded courtyard for the first attendant eunuch. There was no talking, only the quiet flurry of doves overhead and the shuffling of cloth when one girl, trying to adjust her hem, was gently corrected by a low-ranking maid. The evaluation began with a quick glance from head to toe. No words were exchanged, just a marking brush flicking lightly on a bamboo tablet held by the eunuch. Age, skin tone, posture, teeth, the clarity of whites in the eyes. Beauty mattered, yes, but more important was potential, health, obedience. One girl was sent back immediately. Her eyes were too wide apart, the eunuch whispered. Mei Ling remained. Then came the formal cleansing. Not just bathing, but ritual purification. They were brought to the Hall of Harmonious Fragrance, a high-walled marble chamber where 3 older court maids undressed them, took away their robes, hair ornaments and underthings, and burned them in a small copper brazier. A symbolic death. Their old identities disappeared in a whisper of ash. Nude and shivering in the morning cold, the girls were washed with water steeped in mugwort and ginger, believed to purify the body and dispel evil spirits. Their hair was trimmed, nails pared, skin scrubbed until raw. This was not punishment, it was procedure. A concubine must not carry the dust of the outside world into the sacred court. After the bathing, each was issued a simple training robe in grey muslin and soft slippers, with felt soles. Mei Ling ran her fingers over the cloth. There were no seams, no embellishments, no colours. Nothing of herself remained. The room of names. That night, Mei Ling slept on a thin mat in the antechamber of white petals. a small dormitory assigned to new entrants. There were no lanterns allowed, no candles or firelight. Just moonlight slipping through the high lattice window, falling across sleeping forms like silver nets. Every girl in the room had a number. Mei Ling was known for now only as 10th of 9th Hall. The 9th Hall indicated the dormitory she was assigned. 10th was her order of entry. The name would change depending on her standing. If she ascended, perhaps she would become 3rd of 5th Hall or 1st of 2nd Court. And if she displeased, she might be demoted to 17th of Servants' Wing, or worse, erased from the lists altogether. It was not uncommon for a concubine to live and die in the palace without her birth name ever recorded in the archives. The records emphasized placement, not personhood. She whispered her number to herself once, to remember, then again, and again, until the moonlight faded. Training in the arts of stillness. The first days were consumed by posture training. Contrary to the romantic notions painted in poems, a concubine's life was less about flirtation than precision. A woman must know how to walk at exactly the correct pace, neither too slow, which implied hesitation, nor too quick, which implied impatience. She must kneel with her back straight and hands aligned like folded parchment. She must rise without swaying, without bracing herself. If her sleeve fell out of line while bowing, it was noted. If her feet peeked from beneath her robe while sitting, it was marked. Mei Ling's feet ached constantly. Though her family had not bound them, the palace expected at least the illusion of dainty gait. A retired concubine from a previous reign taught them how to curl their toes inside their slippers, subtly, to mimic the swaying walk of the nobility. Speech lessons were worse, not because they were hard, but because they were empty. One learned to speak without expressing opinion. One memorized phrases of greeting, gratitude, apology. No questions were to be asked. Curiosity was dangerous. A concubine was a reed in still water, a new smell to her skin. By the 10th day, Mei Ling noticed something strange. Her own scent was gone. The jasmine oil her mother used to rub into her scalp as a child had vanished. The faint trail of smoked sandalwood that lingered from her family altar, gone. Even her sweat smelled different, as if the air of the Forbidden City had settled. Into her very pores, she had begun to smell like everyone else, like lotus root and camphor, like rice starch and drying paper. No smell meant no identity, and that, she realized, was the point. A glimpse of power. It wasn't until the 3rd week that she saw someone with rank. The 4th consort of the Western Chamber passed through the corridor as Mei Ling was cleaning calligraphy brushes. The consort wore midnight blue robes embroidered with gold cranes, her hair coiled in a heavy bun set with 2 phoenix pins. Mei Ling lowered her gaze, but through her eyelashes she saw the procession. 2 maids, 1 eunuch, and a quiet presence that filled the hall like incense. The consort did not speak. She didn't have to. She walked so slowly that the air behind her seemed to follow in mourning. Mei Ling wondered how many years it took to master that kind of silence. The letter that would never arrive. One of the girls in her dormitory, Yan Yu, confessed one night in whispers that she had written a letter to her mother, smuggled it into a robe hem, hoping a laundry servant might carry it out. The girl was gone the next morning. No announcement, no explanation. The rest of them said nothing. Mei Ling did not ask, but she thought, every day after, how many concubines in centuries past had tried the same. How many had disappeared, and how many stories were trapped behind the high red walls, untold. The moment. She realized she would never leave. It was a simple thing. A sparrow flew into the laundry courtyard one afternoon, fluttering near the hanging linens. For a moment, Mei-ling looked up, smiled. Another girl raised her hand to shoo it away, and a court lady, a woman with the rank of third senior maid, struck her across the knuckles with a bamboo rod. "No gestures unless instructed," she said. Mei-ling lowered her eyes, and in that quiet moment of obedience, she realized she had not smiled in 2 weeks. She had not looked up at the sky. She had not spoken her family name. She was dissolving, softly, politely, like ink fading from a page. And yet, as she lay on her mat that night, a question lingered behind her closed eyes, flickering like a lantern not yet extinguished. Was this how every concubine began? By forgetting? Or did some remember quietly, in the corners of their minds, waiting for something more? The rhythm of life in the Forbidden City was not marked by seasons or festivals, but by bells. The bells did not ring for beauty. They rang for obedience. 4 times each day, the tones rolled across the tiled roofs and echoing courtyards. One bell signaled waking, another called for assembly, a third marked the time for silent meals, and the fourth was the most important. It rang at dusk, when all concubines were required to return to their designated quarters, unless summoned elsewhere. Mei-ling had never been summoned, and in truth, she hoped she never would be. The hierarchy of shadows. The harem was not one entity, but a rigid structure of ranks, corridors, and invisible laws. At the top stood the Empress, known as the Huang Ho. Below her were the Imperial consorts, first, second, third rank women, each with specific privileges, how many rooms they had, how many servants they were assigned, how many characters they were allowed in their titles. Below them were the noble ladies, the talented women, and finally, the attendants. And beneath even that were the girls like Mei-ling, Guan Nu, official palace women, not yet assigned any particular title or duty. It was a pyramid with hundreds of steps and almost no ladders. No one told you the rules. You were meant to observe them. One girl from the 7th hall once borrowed a comb that had been placed on a higher-ranked woman's dressing table. She meant no harm, but within 3 days, her name was removed from the roster and her bed was given to someone else. Rumors said she'd been reassigned to clean the privy rooms outside the North Gate, a polite way of saying, forgotten, Mei-ling, memorized everything, where to stand in line, which direction to bow, which titles to recite when someone passed. If she wasn't sure, she bowed deeper than necessary and kept her face lowered. It was safer not to be seen than to be seen getting it wrong. The language of the body since conversation was restricted. Most communication among the concubines happened. In glances, a raised eyebrow might mean, "Don't step there," a lowered chin. Someone is listening. A twist of the fingers while folding a robe. That eunuch favors the western chambers. Be careful. The older women had developed an entire vocabulary through their movements. A tilt of the teacup, a certain pace when walking the garden path, a pause before answering even the most harmless question. All had meaning. Mei-ling watched them as one might observe the migration of cranes. They moved slowly, deliberately, with elegance born of vigilance. Their silence was not peace. It was armor, the rituals of waiting. Every 5th day, all concubines, regardless of rank, underwent a grooming inspection. Nails were checked for cleanliness, robes for wear and tear, posture for stiffness. One court lady known as Madame Yun, who had served since the previous emperor, carried a long ivory pointer and tapped it gently against any faults. If a woman's hair was found to be out of place, she was reprimanded quietly and told to sit alone at meals for 2 days. If her slippers were dirty, she was denied incense during meditation. It wasn't punishment, not in the harsh sense, but it was deeply effective. Mealing once forgot to fold her hands while waiting in line. A minor breach, barely noticeable. She was assigned to launder cloaks for 3 days in the courtyard, in full view of the others. The ritual, of course, was designed to make her visible and quiet. A single visit from the emperor. Mei Ling did not see him clearly. Not really. One morning, shortly after the spring rains, word spread softly that the emperor would walk through the pavilion of plum blossoms. Not to visit a concubine, but to inspect the seasonal plantings. A practice some emperors considered a form of governance. The concubines stood on the edges of the path, heads lowered, hands folded. No one dared speak. Then, from behind a curtain of white blossoms, a slow procession appeared. The Kangxi emperor walked slowly, his sleeves trailing slightly behind him. His face was unreadable. 2 scholars flanked him, reciting calendar dates and harvest expectations. Behind them, 2 young eunuchs carried scrolls, and one old man fanned the air rhythmically. The emperor did not look at the women. He was not meant to. But at one moment, as the procession curved along the path, Mei Ling thought, just briefly, that his eyes passed over her. Not lingered, not studied, just passed. The breath caught in her throat, and she knew something unspoken. He would not remember her, and perhaps she was meant to be grateful for that. The teacup that tipped the balanced one of the noble ladies, a woman called Lady Han, was rumoured to have once spilled tea near the Empress during a garden banquet. No apology was accepted. Within 2 days, Lady Han was reassigned to an outer residence, and her former position was given to another. But behind the story, Mei Ling learned something more instructive. The spilled tea, it seemed, was not an accident. It had been provoked. Another concubine, of equal rank, had arranged for Lady Han's favourite maid to be reassigned just before the banquet. Lady Han, already on edge, poured her tea with a shaking hand. And so, one porcelain cup, tipped too far, led to years of demotion. No one had spoken ill of her. No one had shouted. No punishment had been announced. Just an accident. And an empty chair the next morning. It taught Mei Ling a lesson more lasting than any rulebook. The harem did not punish with swords. It punished with arrangements. The ink room and the dream of education. In her 3rd month, Mei Ling was given the privilege of attending 2 weekly hours in the ink room, a space reserved for writing practice and etiquette copying. She treasured it, not because she liked calligraphy, but because it allowed her to remember. The smell of inkstone and dry paper reminded her of home, her father's study, the sound of brush against parchment. She copied Confucian lines, over and over. A virtuous woman must guard her tongue. The jewel of obedience outlasts all rubies. The emperor is the son of heaven. His gaze is a river of fate. But between the lines she sometimes added tiny marks of her own, symbols no one else would notice. A looped stroke, a dot too far to the right, a secret alphabet of memory. In the quiet scrape of brushes and coughs, she found the only freedom she had. The flower that didn't bloom. There was one courtyard in the northern wing where concubines planted flowers as part of seasonal offerings. Mei-ling chose a jasmine. She watered it daily, whispered to it when no one listened. She did everything the other girls did, but her plant never bloomed. By late spring, the others had blossoms, red camellias, yellow osmanthus, even a purple orchid or two. Hers remained green, alive, but flowerless. When a visiting courtier passed through the garden and admired the floral display, one of the chambermaids pointed at Mei-ling's jasmine and said, "That one is slow, perhaps next season." And that was all. No punishment, no demotion. But Mei-ling felt her chances wilt with every silent leaf. The clock that could not be seen. There were no clocks in the women's quarters. Not truly. Instead, time was measured by incense. Short sticks for meals, long coils for sleep, special braided cords for festivals. Mei-ling learned how to tell time by the scent, how far the smoke traveled, how long the ash curled, how quickly the heat burned. One evening, when she was alone, she lit an incense cord too early by mistake. She caught herself and quickly doused it. No one saw, but she spent the rest of the night in fear. That was the true currency of the harem. Not gold, not titles, but the things you could never be sure were noticed, and yet always might be. The other Mei-ling. There was, oddly enough, another girl named Mei-ling in the eastern wing. Older by a year, from a different province. Taller, quieter. One day, the older Mei-ling was mistakenly summoned for embroidery duty intended for the younger one. She did not correct the error, and that evening, the eunuchs delivered a praise notice to the wrong dormitory. For 3 weeks afterward, the younger, Mei-ling, the one we follow, was excluded from lantern duty. A small exclusion, but noticed by the others. She realized then, names meant little, faces meant less, and in the palace, even identity was negotiable. And in the stillness, the question returned. If no one knows who you were, if even your mistakes belong to someone else, how do you remember that you are real? The rain began at dawn. Not a storm, not a downpour, just a fine, endless drizzle that coated every rooftop in sheen and softened the sound of footsteps across the glazed stone courtyards. It was a good day for being invisible, and in the inner palace, invisibility was sometimes a blessing. Mei-ling's robe clung damply to her sleeves as she walked the covered corridor between the embroidery room and the laundry chambers. Her task was to return a thread sample, nothing more. But the walk itself had become a ritual. Each time she passed under the carved beams of the northern passage, she would glance to her right, to the patch of sky framed between tiled roofs. A square of light. The letter. She never wrote. Everyone at some point planned it. A secret letter. A hidden message tucked into a robe hem or smuggled under a hair comb. Something addressed to a mother, a sister, a friend. Proof that she still existed, even if only on paper. Mei-ling composed it in her head for months. She knew what she would say. I am alive. I am still Mei-ling. I sew things for women who don't know my name. I have not seen the color red in weeks. I remember how the lake near home looked in the summer. I hope the old tree is still there. But she never wrote it, not because she feared punishment. That was constant. But because she feared the letter might reach no one. And the idea of her words drifting endlessly, read by no one, understood by no one, was worse than silence. The day of the peach. Blossom Festival, it was one of the few days. Concubines were allowed to wear color, a tradition dating back to the Ming Dynasty. The Peach Blossom Festival was meant to symbolize renewal, fertility, and feminine beauty. A single day in spring when each hall could select one woman to wear pink robes and walk the eastern courtyard beneath the blooming trees. The selection was not a contest. It was arbitrary, a name plucked by a senior maid, or perhaps by the luck of timing. Mei Ling was not chosen. She didn't expect to be, but she watched from a small corner near the outer kitchens as the selected women walked beneath the peach trees. Their sleeves floated behind them. Their smiles were gentle, almost unreal. It looked like a painting more than real life. And just for a moment, Mei Ling wondered what it felt like to be seen, even if just once. The legacy of dust. The older concubines, those who had outlasted their prime, often became like furniture. Moved from chamber to chamber, no longer summoned, no longer feared. One of them, Lady Shu, took to teaching embroidery to the newer girls. She had a slight limp and a voice that rasped like rice husk. "Every robe you mend is a memory you'll never own," she once told Mei Ling. But sometimes dust remembers. Mei Ling did not understand. "Footprints fade," Lady Shu continued. "But the dust keeps their shape longer than we think. The dust is patient." And Mei Ling, sitting there with needle in hand, imagined the palace covered in dust. 1,000 years of footsteps, smiles, betrayals, silences, all pressed gently into the floors and walls, waiting. The Emperor's death, and nothing changed. In her 12th month in the palace, Mei Ling heard, through cautious murmurs, that the Emperor had fallen ill. Then, some weeks later, a bell rang, one that had not rung in years. It was the mourning bell. The Kangxi Emperor had died. His son, the Yongzheng Emperor, would ascend. There was no public mourning among the lower-ranked women. No weeping aloud. No black robes. Only more silence. More waiting. More dust. A new name sat on the throne. But nothing changed in the 9th. No one came to see Mei Ling. Her duties remained the same. Her meals the same. But that night, as she returned to her mat, she whispered a single sentence into the darkness. "Even the sun changes, and I am still invisible." The quiet promotion. The following month, without ceremony, Mei Ling's name appeared, on a different list. 5th of 8th Hall. A small shift. A higher floor. A better pillow. 1 additional lamp wick per week. And with that, a new robe in pale blue, and a new wooden tag with her new designation. It wasn't a rise in status. She still had no title. But the list had changed, and in the Forbidden City, being seen by paper was the first step to being seen at all. The dream, she never spoke aloud. Some nights, Mei Ling imagined waking up in her old home, her sister playing, with chopsticks on the floor, the rustle of her father's robes, the steam rising from the kitchen pots. She would get up, stretch, wash her face in the wooden basin, and walk outside. No red walls, no bells, just wind. But the dream always ended the same way. She would turn and find herself in grey robes again, standing in a courtyard with no doors, and behind her the sound of footsteps, fading, and in the silence, one final thought remains. If a life is lived in silence, beneath silk, behind walls, does it still shape history, or does it vanish like breath on a mirror? Before we begin, remember this. palaces were not built for freedom. They were built for management, for rhythm, for power, disguised as elegance. Inside the Forbidden City, behind the filigreed wood screens and beneath the painted beams, life was not slow. It was tightly regulated. Every hour accounted for, every corner swept by a pair of eyes, and within this order, hundreds of women breathed. They did not rule. They did not rebel. They existed under watch. The clock that had no hands time in the inner palace was kept not by clocks, but by people. Before the first rooster crowed, a eunuch would strike a wooden clapper down the central corridor of the southern residences. The clack echoed through the stone floor, stirring the women from their mats. No alarms, no sunbeams, no whispered, "Good morning," just one sound, each day, for every woman. "Wake now." It was the only signal they needed. No one dared sleep through it. For the concubines, daily life was less about pleasure and more about precision. There were strict times for washing, strict times for presenting oneself in the morning roll call, and strict times for appearing unseen in the background of ceremonial walkways. Everything else, conversation, leisure, thought, existed in the in-between. But even that in-between was monitored. The eyes behind the screens, surveillance in the palace was not done with guards or threats. It was far more elegant. It lived in eyes. The Zhaoguan, or watchful maids, were the lowest ranked women in the palace. Young, quiet, and invisible, trained to walk without sound, eat without chewing, and speak only when addressed. They were assigned to observe the concubines, not to serve, but to report how much food a woman ate, whether she spoke in her sleep, if she was hoarding hairpins, if she wept during incense prayer. They blended in. Sometimes they were indistinguishable from other servants. Sometimes a concubine wouldn't even know which of her maids was assigned to watch her. And sometimes one concubine was assigned to watch another. It was never stated aloud, but everyone knew the palace did not need chains. It had silence and suspicion, silken scripts, and the ink of obedience. Each morning, after roll call, the concubines who were literate would gather in the Hall of Harmonious Ink, a place to practice calligraphy, read poetry, or copy texts by the emperor's decree. But it was never truly about education. The texts they were told to copy were not history or literature. They were prescribed reflections, passages from Confucian manuals on female virtue, loyalty, chastity, and domestic restraint. A woman's virtue lies in her stillness. To gaze beyond one's rank is to forget one's place. The ink of reflection is more sacred than gold. The act of writing these lines, again and again, served two purposes. It quieted the mind. It documented the soul. Once a week, the eunuchs collected the copied sheets, not for grading, but for review. The way a woman shaped her characters, how much pressure she applied, where her thoughts wandered, it was all interpreted. A single smudge in the wrong phrase could raise questions. Was she trembling, tired, or rebellious? No answer was ever given, only subtle consequences. Removal from a duty roster, an extra inspection, less firewood in her quarters. The ink judged in silence. Meals. Without taste food in the inner palace was never cold, but it was always bland. Each concubine was served her own portion. Rice, steamed greens, 2 side dishes, and soup. Meat appeared, only on feast days unless you held a rank high enough for regular favors, and even then, every bite was watched. Poison was always a concern, though rarely actualized. The real fear was disobedience. Refusing a dish, requesting more, or showing preference was discouraged. To say, "I do not like this," was to imply choice, and choice had no place in the harem. Some women learned to eat so carefully that their lips never touched the rim of the bowl. Some chewed without movement in their jaw, and some, especially the older women, ate slowly to prolong the only quiet moment they were granted all day. The best compliment one could offer the kitchen was nothing at all. The walk that measured rank. There was no greater performance than the daily walk. Each afternoon, ranked women were permitted to stroll the path of petal stones, a long winding promenade beneath trellises and decorative arches. The route had no functional purpose, but it offered visibility. A noble lady might walk at the center, a talented woman on the outer edge. Attendants remained behind the columned shade. There was no guidebook, just instinct and risk. Too fast, and you drew suspicion. Too slow, and you seemed lazy. Too happy, and you were frivolous. Too sad, and you might be plotting. The safe expression was none at all. A blank, porcelain face. A pace just slower than urgency. Sleeves held together, chin slightly down. The daily walk was not about the fresh air, a hint of pomelo on a collar, a whiff of cinnamon in a sleeve. It was forbidden, of course, but it was also understood. The palace knew everything. It simply chose what to punish. The sound that never ceased at night. The palace was quiet, but not silent. There was always the wind, brushing over the tiled roofs, the distant shuffle of slippers, the faint clang of metal bells tied to laundry lines, clicking as they dried. But most haunting were the midnight drums. The watches of the night, 6 drum beats spaced through the dark hours, signaled to the guards and the palace timekeepers that all was well. For concubines, they were not comfort. They were reminders. 1 drum beat. It's midnight. You're still here. 2 drum beats. It's later now. You haven't changed. 3. You've survived another hour, another moment, another breath of someone else's life, and so on. Until the first clapper rang again at dawn, and the entire system reset. And then came a new question, drifting softly with the 4th drum beat. If the palace sees all, hears all, collects every word and breath, what happens to the parts of yourself you never dared to reveal? There was a saying in the harem. The tighter the silk is wrapped, the less the body breathes. It was not about fashion. It was about systems. By the 2nd month in any woman's stay within the Forbidden City, the mechanisms of surveillance were no longer visible. They became normal, internalized, self-correcting. A concubine didn't need to be watched after a while. She had learned to monitor herself. The registry of breaths. Every woman in the inner palace was accounted for in a thick, stitched registry. It did not include biographies, birthdays, or family details. Those were kept in separate ledgers, filed in storage rooms lined with bamboo slips and silk folders. This book contained only placement and observations. For example, 8th hall, 4th, woman, moderate appetite, compliant, unsure gaze. 10th hall, 2nd woman, restless fingers, writes excessively in margins. 2nd court, noble lady Ling, silent in morning rolls, speaks softly, favors garden duties. Eunuchs carried it during inspection rounds. Any deviation, such as an unauthorized accessory or a forgotten hair ribbon, was logged in careful brushwork. Mealing once caught a glimpse of the entry under her name. 8th hall, 5th woman, Quiet, efficient with needle, rarely speaks. Potential for robe duties. She had become a sentence, and yet she knew. A sentence in the registry was better than a blank space, because blank spaces meant you had become forgettable. The water ritual at twilight, each concubine was expected to perform the water offering, a simple act of reverence before retiring to her quarters. She knelt before a shallow ceramic bowl placed in the center of the chamber. With both hands, she ladled warm water over a small jade stone, symbolizing the emperor, 3 times without splashing. Then she whispered a prepared line. As the water nourishes jade, may my service nourish the throne. It didn't matter whether she believed it. The ritual was recorded. A maid stood outside with a checklist. If the ladle clinked too loudly, if the concubine rushed her recitation, or forgot the bow at the end, it was noted. There were no punishments, just fewer opportunities. That was the quiet cruelty of the system. You were not harmed for missteps. You were simply not invited. The pillow talkers. There existed, within the palace, a rare but dangerous breed of woman, the pillow talker. These were concubines favored enough to be summoned to the emperor's bedchamber, though not necessarily for intimacy. Sometimes they were called simply to soothe, sing, or keep silence while the emperor slept. It was seen as an honor, but it came with consequences. The moment a woman stepped into the hall of heavenly quiet, she was escorted by 2 eunuchs. She was bathed, powdered, dressed in perfumed silks, then searched thoroughly for hidden letters, pins, or hairpieces that could be used for harm or seduction. Nothing sharp was permitted, not even fingernails. Hands were often wrapped loosely in gauze, and afterward, she was questioned. What did he say? Did he ask about the empress? Was his tone reflective or distracted? Did he cough? Did he drink tea? Did he mention the census? The pillow talker became a witness, a vessel, a risk. Some women were never summoned again. Some became permanent favorites, and some vanished within days. No one asked why. The festival without joy. One would think festivals brought celebration, but inside the inner palace, they brought inspection. During the Double Ninth Festival, a holiday marked by chrysanthemums and mountain climbing, concubines were required to prepare poems for recitation. They were judged not on brilliance, but on tone. Too much ambition in the writing was dangerous. Too little enthusiasm seemed disrespectful. One woman, Young Mei, wrote a delicate verse comparing the emperor's wisdom to a river nourishing the people. It was praised by her teacher, but during the reading, her voice trembled. A senior maid accused her of sarcasm. Young Mei's name was later absent from the work duty schedule. When asked, the maid simply said, "She has been assigned to stillness." No further explanation. The silks. That listened, Mei Ling's embroidery work had progressed. She was now entrusted with court banners, long scrolls of red silk marked with calligraphic proverbs used during ceremonial visits. But one afternoon, while mending a torn emblem, she overheard 2 senior servants whispering near the open window. One spoke of a concubine whose family had fallen into disfavor outside the walls. Her cousin had been arrested for a land dispute. Though the woman in question had no involvement, she had been placed under internal review. Her duties were reduced, her maids rotated, her access to ink suspended. That was how politics filtered into the inner palace. Silently, like dust under the door, Mei Ling stitched faster. The silks listened, but they would never speak. The laughter that cost. Too much in the courtyard near the lotus pond, one of the younger women, Lulu, laughed aloud while helping untangle a wind-blown curtain. It was not inappropriate, not mocking, just a single laugh, light and brief. But it was heard. A minor eunuch took note. Nothing was said. The next day, Lulu was assigned to night laundry duty. No one mentioned the laugh again, but everyone remembered it. The watcher in the mirror. There was a mirror in Mei Ling's quarters, not silvered glass, but polished bronze, slightly warped, the kind that blurred rather than reflected clearly. One night, while brushing her hair, Mei Ling stared into it for longer than usual. The face that looked back was hers, and yet it wasn't. The eyebrows were thinner, the cheeks paler, the lips pursed unconsciously. A year ago she had laughed when she read poems, smiled when she saw birds, flinched when scolded. Now she reacted to nothing. She looked calm, controlled, like the other women, like she was supposed to, and yet something in her eyes whispered back, "Are you still in there?" She didn't answer. A pair of slippers left unclaimed in the laundry corridor. Mei Ling once found a pair of slippers, too small for most women, stained at the edges, left neatly by the wall, as if their owner might return. But no one claimed them. No one mentioned them. They stayed there for 3 days, then vanished. She often thought about the woman who wore them. Had she been reassigned, demoted, removed, or had she simply chosen quietly to stop showing up? Even in a system of rules, disappearance was still possible. And that night, a question bloomed quietly in Mei Ling's mind, like ink in water, in a place where everything is watched. What does it mean to vanish? The Forbidden City was a marvel of engineering, of symmetry and symbolism. Stone courtyards stretched in perfect grids. The roofs sloped at sacred angles, and every gate led to another gate, another hall, another screen. But the most powerful structure inside the palace was not one built of wood or stone. It was the unspoken rule, and by Mei Ling's second year inside the 9th hall, she understood that the rules most dangerous to break were the ones no one ever said aloud. The paper without a name. In spring, Mei Ling was handed a slip of rice paper without signature or seal. It had been folded 3 times, pressed flat between 2 pages of an embroidery pattern. A servant had passed it to her as if by accident. The paper read, "Do not accept the lotus comb. Let her have it." That was all. No instructions, no threat, no greeting. But Mei Ling understood. The next day, during assignment of ceremonial accessories for the upcoming Lantern Festival, she was offered a carved ivory hair comb inlaid with lotus petals, an obvious sign of favor. She hesitated, bowed, and softly declined. Lady Jen, a second rank consort, accepted it instead with a nod and a smile that didn't touch her eyes. Later, Mei Ling was given plum blossom hairpins, less symbolic, less precious, but still respectable. And that night, her lamp oil ration was doubled. She never asked who had sent the note, and she never spoke of it again. The Ghost Walk. There was a hallway in the palace, narrow, plain, built between the lesser storerooms and the outer kitchen. The favor that felt like a trap mid-autumn brought new roles to the palace. Each year, a few lower-ranked women were chosen to prepare the ceremonial incense bundles for the emperor's inner chamber. It was an act of trust. Only those with still hands and silent mouths were selected. Mei Ling was one of them. She was not told why. Inside the room of fragrant offerings, She worked with 3 other women, none of whom she'd met before. They spoke in nods and gestures, winding sandalwood threads and layering crushed spices in waxed parchment. Everything was counted: 16 cloves, 3 shavings of agar wood, 7 drops of lotus resin. There was no room for improvisation, no scent out of place. On the second day, one woman fainted from the smoke. She was carried out by eunuchs and never returned. No one asked her name, and the task was never mentioned in Mei Ling's duty schedule again. She received no praise, only a new pair of slippers at the end of the week. A quiet message: you obeyed. You are seen, but being seen wasn't always a reward. Sometimes it was a warning. The dream of gold, the reality of dust one of the older concubines, Lady Yun, once held rank as a consort during the previous emperor's reign. She had been demoted under mysterious circumstances, but allowed to remain within the palace due to age and seniority. She had gold-threaded cushions, 2 servants, and a quiet chamber facing the western wall. But when Mei Ling was sent to deliver thread samples to her quarters, she saw something unusual. Lady Yun was kneeling before a cracked mirror. Her hands were empty. Her eyes were closed. She was not praying. She was waiting, not for death, for memory. Mei Ling stood silently until dismissed. Later that evening, someone whispered that Lady Yun had once composed an original melody that made the emperor smile, but it had not been documented. And now, no one remembered the tune, not even Lady Yun. The visit of the inspector. Once every season, the palace inspector of female affairs arrived from the outer ministries. Always a woman, always dressed in grey, always with a scribe. She asked no questions. She simply stood in the courtyard while the concubines lined up. Each bowed. Each presented a silk token embroidered with her number and hall. The inspector examined them, not like people, but like fabric, looking for tears, creases, flaws. Then she left. Her report was sent not to the emperor, but to the empress, dowager, and the inner court council. Sometimes after a visit, a name disappeared from the registry. Sometimes a woman was promoted, but mostly nothing changed, because change was not the goal. Control was. The words that were never meant to be heard. Late one night, Mei Ling overheard 2 maids whispering behind the bathhouse, their voices low, urgent. One said, "If she writes it, she will not survive the month." The other, "Then she must not write it, even if it's true." There was a pause. "But what if someone already has?" Footsteps approached. The conversation ended. Mei Ling walked away quickly, her slippers nearly silent. She did not know what it was, but she never looked at the ink room the same way again. The painting in the storage hall. During a seasonal reshuffle, Mei Ling was assigned to assist in sorting ceremonial items stored in the cold scroll hall, a quiet warehouse of unused paintings, tapestries, and festival decorations. She found a half-faded scroll tucked behind others. It depicted the inner garden in springtime, but not the official version. In this one, women were smiling. One held a bird in her hand. Another let her hair down. A third had turned away, eyes closed, head tilted toward the sun. It was unsigned. She rolled it back up carefully, placed it behind the others, and said nothing. But she remembered the scene, because it was the only time in the entire palace that she saw women who looked alive. And finally, on her quiet walk back to the 8th hall, Mei Ling asked herself one final question for the night. If no one writes your story, and no one is allowed to see your truth, did. Your life happen, or was it simply archived? They were called golden lilies, not because they bloomed, but because they were crushed. 3-inch feet, the standard of beauty, the mark of refinement, the quiet gate pass into courtly ranks that many women never questioned, because they were bound too young to remember a life before pain. In the inner palace, a woman's feet rarely touched soil, but long before she arrived inside the forbidden city, her body was already reshaped to fit a life behind walls. The first bind mailing's feet were not bound. That detail followed her like a shadow, even though no one mentioned it aloud. Her family, gentry, but pragmatic, had chosen not to start the process. Her father reasoned that strong feet meant useful daughters. Her mother, privately, had wept with relief. But in the court, this mercy became a mark of difference. Most concubines had endured the binding ritual between ages 5 and 7. The process was never ceremonial. No incense, no songs, just warm water, tight cloth, and silence. The bones in the arch were broken gradually. The toes curled downward toward the sole, pressed and wrapped again and again, twice a day for months. Infection was common, so was permanent, limp. But girls who succeeded earned new names. Fragrant lotus, willow step, silent lily. Their walk became an offering. Their pain, proof of status. Walking as performance. In the inner palace, walking was not simply movement. It was spectacle. A concubine's pace told a story. A slow glide was elegance. A subtle sway, sensuality. Hesitation betrayed fear. Stiffness suggested low birth. The highest-ranking women had perfected the art of bound grace. They moved as though suspended by thread. Arms folded, shoulders relaxed, feet shuffling in a figure-8 rhythm that emphasized balance and modesty. Even when standing still, their posture hinted at choreography. Mailing, despite her poise, lacked the signature limp. Her steps were too even, too natural. It wasn't a failing, exactly, but it marked her as less courtly, more like a servant than a symbol. So she practiced. She shortened her stride, curled her toes in her slippers, rolled her weight across the sides of her feet. It hurt, but not enough. Real elegance, the palace whispered, required a foundation of bone-deep sacrifice. The woman with broken feet. In the 4th hall lived a concubine named Jinrong, older, nearly 30. Her feet were considered perfect. 3 inches flat, tightly curved, with a small gap between arch and floor that could cradle a peach pit. Her walk was so delicate, it barely stirred dust, but she rarely walked. Behind her embroidered slippers were scars that reopened every week. Her maid changed the bandages daily. Her legs swelled often. Some nights, she wept into the sleeves of her robe, while incense burned behind her in still silence. Still, during festivals, she was chosen to lead the ceremonial dance. Every year, because beauty in the court was measured not by how freely you moved, but by how silently you endured. The slipper competition. Once, a season, a quiet contest was held among the lower-ranked women. The rules were never spoken. No prizes were announced. But every concubine knew, you must leave your slippers outside the bath chamber, and someone, always someone unseen, would come and measure, not with rulers, with glance, comparison, discretion. Whispers would ripple afterward. Her pair is smaller than lady hands. Did you see how high her arch was? She must have come from a noble family. One year, a woman from the Western Hall, soft-spoken and previously ignored, was chosen for a festival reading after her slippers were praised. She said nothing, but her walk changed after that. Slower, more intentional. A single inch could change your standing, even if it cost you every step for the rest of your life. The forbidden footprints on. Snowy mornings, concubines were forbidden from walking in the open courtyards until the paths were brushed. Why? Because footprints left behind could betray secrets. A long stride, too bold. A heavy step, unladylike. A crooked trail, disrespect. Mei Ling once saw a woman, possibly from the Eastern Quarter, brush away her own footprints with her sleeve after stepping outside too early. It wasn't punishment she feared, it was perception. In the Forbidden City, there was no such thing as an innocent step. The bone closet. In one of the lesser-known storage halls near the laundry basins, an old maid told Mei Ling a strange rumor. There was once a room in the older palace where concubines' broken binding boards and cracked toe braces were stored. Dozens of them, lined on the wall like relics, some with bloodstains never washed out, some still carrying the scent of camphor and vinegar. They called it the bone closet. Not because it held real bones, but because it remembered the shaping of them. The room had been sealed for decades, but the pain was still practiced. The unbound ones. Not every concubine had bound feet. Some came from tribes in the north or west. Some were taken as diplomatic gifts from outer regions, too old to be bound, or from cultures where the practice never existed. They were assigned quarters far from the central courts. Their role was clear, to remain different. One woman, a Uyghur consort named Dilara, was known for her music. She played a stringed instrument no one else could, and one night, Mei Ling sat in her chamber, slippers off, feet bare against the stone floor, and wondered, is suffering what makes us worthy? Or have we simply learned to mistake pain for purpose? The morning was cool, overcast, and unusually quiet. The kind of grey that settled over the courtyards, like a pause in conversation. Delicate, expectant. Mei Ling stood near the basin, rubbing her hands together as she waited for the water to warm. It had been several weeks since the Slipper Festival, and though no names were officially praised, she had noticed a subtle shift in who walked where, who stood closer to the chamber doors, who got the better lamps. She hadn't been one of them, but she had observed. And in the Forbidden City, observation was sometimes more powerful than success. The whisper of cloth. There were some women who glided so softly that their movements were known only by the shift of their sleeves, the faint brush of brocade over stone, the sound of wind catching the edge of a robe. To walk like that required more than grace. It required a rewiring of the body. Bound feet had to relearn how to hold balance, how to favor the thigh and hip over the heel. It was said that a properly bound concubine could walk with a bowl of hot water balanced on her head and not spill a single drop. But few could. Most bore the cost in private. Calluses on the knees. Thighs strained from decades of compensation. Some women developed a kind of sideways lean over time, a posture that whispered submission before they even bowed. The body became the performance. The pain became the backdrop. The girl from the South Hall. She was new, no older than 15, and assigned to one of the Western dormitories. Her name was Lian, and her feet were freshly bound. Too freshly. She could barely walk. Her steps were uneven, strained. She tried to hide it, but each wince revealed the truth. Her family had begun the process too late. Perhaps they thought the palace wouldn't notice. They were wrong. After 3 weeks, she was moved from her hall. No reason given. Her slippers, once embroidered with magnolias, were replaced with plainer ones. Some said she had been reassigned to paper sorting in the Imperial archive. A quiet exile. Mei-ling never saw her again. But once, late at night, she passed by the far courtyard and found a single magnolia slipper lying abandoned beside the stone steps. She didn't touch it. She simply watched it for a moment and moved on. The dance of tired bodies. There were ceremonial dances every season, especially during Imperial, birthdays or religious festivals. Though few concubines were chosen to perform, all were required to practice, just in case. The choreography was simple but strict. Each movement traced a sacred form, arms raised like cranes, fingers curved in imitation of falling petals. The feet shuffled forward in half steps, swaying in time with the slow thud of a drum. It looked serene. It felt like endurance. The younger women smiled through it. The older ones winced when they turned. A few had secret tricks, padding hidden in their slippers, special oils to numb the heel. But for most, the only salve was knowing it would end. One woman, Yue Qin, collapsed midway through a rehearsal. Her foot had bled through the silk of her slipper. No one rushed to help. They simply turned away, let the eunuchs carry her off. Because to acknowledge pain openly was to admit the price of the role. And in the Forbidden City, even compassion could cost you standing. The robe with the golden thread one day, Mei-ling was tasked with repairing a hem on a ceremonial robe. The trim was lined with gold-wrapped thread, the kind used only for high-ranking consorts. As she adjusted the fabric, she noticed a line of faded bloodstains beneath the stitching, old, nearly invisible. The thread had been sewn over them. Someone had bled in that robe, not in battle, not in childbirth, in performance. She paused, touched the edge gently, and then continued sewing. Because in this place, blood was not shocking. It was simply part of the fabric. The shrine to unspoken sacrifice. Deep within the Jade Pavilion, a place few concubines ever visited, was a small stone altar, supposedly erected during the Ming dynasty. No official worship took place there, and no incense was offered. But women still visited, quietly. Some left tokens, a petal, a folded cloth, a single strand of hair. Rumors said the shrine had once honored a woman who died from complications during foot binding. No one knew her name. She had been prepared for court entry, but her feet never healed. Rather than send her home, they buried her beneath the stones, not to shame her, but to make her part of the palace. Mei-ling once knelt there. She didn't bring an offering, but she whispered a name anyway, her own. And as the sun sank behind the tiled ridges that evening, she asked herself, is elegance a gift, or just pain with better posture? And if the world only sees your poise, does it matter what? It cost you. The palace celebrated Chongyang, the Double Ninth Festival, with chrysanthemums, poetry, and courtly procession. But for the women of the inner palace, especially those who bore the signs of bound feet, the celebration marked something else entirely. It was the time of year when their poise was on display, when the act of walking became a pageant. Where pain had to look like beauty, where endurance was mistaken for refinement, and where Mei-ling, still unbound, would be seen again for what she lacked. A cloak of embarrassment. It wasn't said directly. No one in the palace ever said such things aloud. But on the morning of the festival, as robes were laid out and jewelry selected, Mei Ling noticed her place was a step behind the others. Not in punishment, just tradition. Concubines with bound feet were assigned the central columns of the garden promenade, the symbolic spine of the procession. Those without were placed to the sides, their faces visible, but their steps less watched. It was not cruel. It was how things were. And so, Mei Ling walked slowly along the outer edge, her sleeves folded, her face still. She smiled when she was meant to. She bowed when required. But each step felt heavier than the last, not because of pain, but because of presence. The girl who undid her wrapping late that evening, long after the festival lights had dimmed, Mei Ling returned to the communal bathing room and found a girl sobbing behind a folding screen. It was Chunhua, a quiet concubine from the lower east wing. Her feet were small, perfectly curved, the envy of many. But that night, she had unwrapped them. The bindings lay beside her, twisted cotton strips, streaked with dried blood and vinegar. Her bare feet, fragile and purple, trembled in the steam rising from the bathwater. Mei Ling said nothing. She simply sat beside her, and the two of them breathed quietly until the lamps burned low. Sometimes, rebellion wasn't a scream. Sometimes, it was simply the act of undoing a knot. The ceremony of steps a week after the festival, a new consort arrived from the outer provinces, Lady Pei, daughter of a regional governor. She had perfect manners and exquisitely bound feet. To welcome her, the harem performed the ceremony of graceful arrival, a choreographed walk across the crimson promenade. Each concubine, in order of rank, stepped forward in a slow, sweeping arc. The pathway was polished stone, the distance short, but the pressure immense, Lady Pei observed silently. Mei Ling, when her turn came, walked as she had been trained, carefully, steadily, her toes curled into the front of her slippers, her body tilted ever so slightly, mimicking the sway of those with bound feet. She did not stumble, she did not falter, but she was too smooth, and from the edge of her vision, she caught the flick of Lady Pei's fan closing. Not out of approval, but dismissal. She had walked too well. And in the Forbidden City, sometimes skill was mistaken for defiance. The foot that failed one woman, Yujin of the Seventh Hall, had bound feet that no longer obeyed her. She had fallen during a ceremonial tea pouring the previous month the court physician had visited. Her left foot was infected. She had been given balm, rest, and reassignment. Now she peeled vegetables in the inner kitchens. She moved with a cane. She no longer walked in processions. Mei Ling passed her once and bowed quietly. Yujin smiled, genuinely, for the first time. Because in losing the ability to walk with grace, she had been freed from the performance. Not the walls, not the titles, but the expectation. And sometimes, in the palace, that was the greatest freedom of all. The sandalwood lesson. One afternoon during embroidery duty, Mei Ling was called to the personal chambers of a senior lady, consort Anne. No explanation. She arrived, bowed, and waited. Consort Anne, seated behind a screen, held a pair of carved wooden sandals in her hand. They were tiny, exquisite, unsuitable for walking. "You have good posture," she said, not looking at Mei Ling, "but your steps are too clean." A pause. "You must learn to soften them." Mei Ling nodded. She was handed the sandals and instructed to wear them every afternoon for 1 hour, alone. The pain was immediate, the arch too high. the wood too hard. But she understood the message. If she could not have bound feet, she would need to appear as though she did. And so, she walked in circles beneath the cloistered garden, each step a rehearsal in illusion, each wince a lesson. The disappearance of Snow Petal. Snow Petal was the nickname of a concubine who had once danced for the emperor during the Spring Lantern Festival. Her feet were said to be the smallest in the palace. Her walk, the most delicate. Then one day she vanished. No ceremony, no scandal, just gone. The official story was that she had been transferred to an outer retreat for health reasons, but a laundry maid later whispered that she had refused further binding treatments after an injury. She had walked too fast one day. The palace could forgive imperfection, but it could not forgive betraying the image. The quiet refusal in. Her second winter, Myling made a choice. She kept the wooden sandals beneath her cot, wrapped in linen. She wore them when required, practiced her sway, adjusted her sleeves to match the rhythm. But on mornings when the frost touched the eaves and the clappers were late to sound, she let herself walk. Normally, just for a moment, from the basin to the window. Her real walk, the one she had not forgotten. And, with each step, she reminded herself, she was not broken, not yet. And as she lit her evening lamp, the question came again, as softly as a slipper brushing stone. What is beauty if it's built on silence? And if the world claps for your suffering, is that still grace? Before the emperor lifted a spoon, another tongue had tasted it. Before the empress sipped her tea, another throat had swallowed it. Before any courtly delicacy reached the lips of power, it passed through a quieter mouth. A mouth trained not for pleasure, but for survival. These were the palace food tasters, not noble, not titled, not praised in poems, but every day they risked their lives for meals that weren't theirs. The first mouthful in the back chamber of the Hall of Nourished Harmony, a young taster named Anley sat at a lacquered table. Before her, laid out with exquisite precision, were 3 dishes: turtle soup thickened with ginseng, steamed pork dumplings in broth, and a small plate of sliced peaches dusted with sugar. She did not eat. She performed, a ritual as exacting as any religious rite. First, she inhaled the scent, slowly, deeply, watching for bitterness, the warning aroma of ground herbs that did not belong. Then, with her silver spoon, she took a single bite, not large enough to swallow unnoticed, not small enough to be dismissed. She chewed slowly, her tongue pressing the food against the roof of her mouth, feeling for powder, oil, metallic notes. If the bite passed inspection, she swallowed and waited. 10 minutes, eyes open, face calm. Only then would the dish be passed to the consort it was intended for. Anley did this 12 times a day, for 3 years. Peach. Season was dangerous. Peaches were beloved in the Qing court, symbols of longevity, beauty, and divine favor. They appeared in porcelain motifs, silk tapestries, and scroll paintings of paradise. But in reality, they were treacherous, because their sweet flesh masked bitterness easily, because pits could be ground into powder, because soft fruit spoiled, invisibly, fermenting from within, because a spoiled peach looked the same as a ripe one, until the stomach turned. So every taster feared peach season, especially Anley. Her mentor had died after a midsummer banquet. The dessert had been a peach jelly served with dried hawthorn slices. It took 15 minutes, not fast enough to warn anyone, but fast enough to disappear. Her name was struck from the roster within the hour, and Anli was called up to replace her. That was her promotion. The gift of a plate no food entered the inner palace without passing 3 gates. At each, the dish was logged. The kitchen recorded its ingredients. The eunuchs verified the recipe, and the tasters, not just 1, but 2 or 3, sampled the final version before it left the preparation zone. Still, accidents happened. One consort, Lady Wen, once found a hair in her soup. She said nothing aloud. She didn't have to. The next day, the entire kitchen staff was rotated out, not punished, just reassigned, a clean slate, because shame, like poison, spread silently. Anli never let her own hair show beneath her cap again. She pinned it tighter each morning and carried a small cloth to wipe her lips between tastings, though no one had asked her to, the tea that was too quiet. One autumn afternoon, Anli was assigned to a tea-pairing session for Lady Li, a concubine known for her sharp tongue and elaborate tastes. The tea had been brewed from white chrysanthemum, steeped with dried apricot and licorice root. It smelled fine. It tasted bland. Too bland. She said nothing. But as the second taster stepped in, his eyes widened slightly. He looked at Anli, said, "Nothing either. They reported a possible substitution. No accusation. No drama. Just a mark in the logbook." The tea was destroyed. A new pot brewed. And 2 days later, the herb vendor who had supplied the dried apricot was arrested outside the western gate. No public explanation was offered. But Anli knew, because silence was how safety survived. A taster's tongue, it was said, that a taster's tongue could remember 300 ingredients by taste alone. Anli didn't count, but she had developed a sixth sense. Too much clove? Someone trying to cover bitterness. Too sweet? Someone nervous. Too perfect. Dangerous. She once rejected a batch of steamed lotus buns because they were too uniform. Each crease in the dough identical, too consistent for a hand-shaped item. That batch never left the kitchen. Later, the cook was found hoarding rice vinegar behind the apothecary hall. Why, no one ever discovered. But he was dismissed, and the story became part of taster lore. Never trust what looks flawless. The women who swallowed first. The tasters were not all women, but most were. They were selected from orphanages, distant provinces, or among the daughters of disgraced officials seeking to redeem family names. They were trained to be invisible, unmarried, unbound, but not unimportant. They learned the signs of almond, aconite, powdered nightshade. They learned to keep their faces still when their stomachs twisted. They learned how to delay a swallow until a supervisor looked away. They learned how to live in the first bite. And most importantly, they learned how to die quietly, if it came to that. And one night, while sitting beneath a paper lantern in the tasting hall, Anli whispered into her tea, "What is loyalty if the person you protect never knows your name? And how many lives must a taster save before she is remembered for something other than surviving?" In the grand halls of the Forbidden City, where walls whispered and silk never wrinkled, death didn't always arrive with a dagger. Sometimes it came in a syrup glaze, a rice dumpling, or the bitter trace of root tucked inside a honey cake. And so the tasters kept tasting, and the kitchens kept cooking. Meals were records, mouthfuls were risks, and behind every banquet stood those who swallowed. First, a bite of mooncake. During the Mid-Autumn Festival, the palace was adorned with glowing paper lanterns and tables stacked with mooncakes, dense, sweet pastries filled with lotus paste. or salted duck egg yolk. The emperor himself would bite into one during the ceremonial viewing of the moon. That meant testing began early. Anli was assigned a specific variety, lotus and walnut, dusted with osmanthus petals. It looked ordinary, but something about the pastry felt heavy, not in weight, but in silence. She sampled it anyway. The flavor was off. Not bad, just unfamiliar, slightly tannic. The way iron water tastes if drawn from the wrong well. She didn't flinch, didn't spit. Instead, she nodded once and discreetly set the piece aside. The supervisor said nothing, but the batch was pulled. 2 hours later, a junior kitchen maid confessed to using walnut shells from a private stash, imported from the south. Not contaminated, just not recorded, and in the forbidden city. That was enough to end a career. The plum pit test each season. The tasters trained with dried fruits, plums, cherries, apricots. Fruits that were sweet on the tongue but deadly if not prepared properly. It was said that a single bitter almond could carry the poison of a dozen berries. So Anli practiced biting through flesh, testing for resistance, inspecting color. She learned to roll a plum pit across her tongue and feel for the fine line between tang and toxin. There were drills, silent ones. Once, a supervisor slipped a drop of vinegar into her sample dish. She passed. Another time, they added a sliver of betel nut to her soup. Her throat tightened. Her pulse quickened. She didn't panic. She drank water, waited, recorded her reaction, and survived. The test wasn't just the poison, it was the pause. Could you wait with death in your mouth and still think clearly? The woman with the pearl. Spoon. Not all tasters were as quiet as Anli. There was one, older, sharper, named Ju. She wore her hair pinned in a crown of tight braids and always carried her own tasting spoon, carved from mother of pearl. Ju had tasted for the Empress herself. Rumors said she had once swallowed a spoonful of shark fin soup laced with crushed daffodil bulb and survived through sheer will. Others said she simply vomited fast enough. Ju never confirmed either version, but she did say one thing, often. A real taster knows when not to taste. She taught Anli how to read the cook's hands, how to spot hesitation during ladling, how to detect fear in how a tray was carried. Poison, she said, rarely arrives confidently. It comes with a flinch, and once you saw the flinch, you could refuse the bite. The slow meal of consort. Ching consort Ching, elegant and pale, once ordered a private evening meal of steamed eel, pickled radish, and peach compote. She dined alone in her garden chamber. 3 tasters, including Anli, were assigned. Each sampled, different dishes, all passed, all waited. The meal was delivered, but consort Ching didn't eat. She turned the dishes away, said she had changed her mind. And that night, 2 of the kitchen boys were removed from duty. No explanation. The next morning, Consort Ching requested coal porridge and did not speak to anyone. Anli didn't ask why, but she marked that day in her memory, because sometimes refusing a meal was the most dangerous move of all. The taste of iron once. During winter, a consort complained that her mutton soup tasted of rust. No poison was found. No illness followed. But for days, the tasters sampled only broths. Morning to night. Clear. White. Red. Thick. Thin. Anli drank nearly 20 bowls in 2 days. She didn't sleep well. Her mouth tasted of salt and marrow. She stopped noticing hunger. When asked for a report, she said, "They're clean." But the clay pots are old. New pots were ordered, not because they were dangerous, but because someone in power said they might be. And in the Forbidden City, fear could change the menu faster than a knife. The funeral without mourning it happened during a summer heat wave. One of the newer tasters, barely 16, collapsed after sampling pickled melon slices. She didn't die immediately. She was carried to the infirmary. She was pale, sweating, unable to speak. Her name was Lan Anli had seen her twice. A quiet girl. Careful. Always double-checking the tray edges for smudges. Lan passed away 3 nights later. No poison was ever confirmed. No memorial held. But her name was removed from the tasting schedule, and her quarters swept clean. Anli folded, her own napkin tighter that week. Because mourning was not part of the job, survival was. The bite. She refused, and once, only once, Anli did something no one expected. She refused a dish. A shrimp custard with sesame glaze. Perfectly presented. Expertly cooked. No odor out of place. But she looked at the cook's face. The eyes darted. She watched how the maid carrying it stumbled slightly, an act she'd seen rehearsed in other contexts. She felt it in her chest before she tasted it, and so she bowed her head and said, "This dish has not been cleared." The supervisor frowned, but he accepted it. The dish was removed. Nothing was ever confirmed. But that week, Lady Jinhai, the intended recipient, fell suddenly ill from another meal. Coincidence or warning? Anli didn't ask. She simply tightened her braid the next day and sharpened her attention. And late one evening, while sitting under the amber glow of a hanging lantern, she let this thought drift through her mind. What if tasting isn't just about danger? What if it's how power lets you prove you're still willing to stay alive? By the 3rd year of her service, Anli no longer flinched when tasting something unknown. She no longer hesitated before lifting a spoon or dipping a silver pick into a mound of soft rice. Its scent sharp with ginger or sweetened with date syrup. She no longer needed time to recover after chewing bitter roots or sampling unknown oils. What had once been fear had become reflex, and what had once been a body trained to survive had become a machine tuned to detect risk by the temperature of soup alone. But beneath the mastery, something had begun to fray, not in her body, in her mind, the dish that no one ordered. One morning in early spring, Anli arrived at the testing hall to find a new entry on the menu slate. A rare steamed crab and tofu dish with dried orange peel. It was a southern coastal specialty, uncommon in the Forbidden City. The Empress had not requested it. Neither had any consort. Still, the dish had been prepared. A delicate pattern was carved into the tofu surface. Imperial cranes etched with a lacquered chopstick. The flavor, Anli was told, had been requested as a surprise. She sampled it. The crab was sweet, the tofu mild, the orange peel sharp on the finish. No bitterness, no strange texture, no aftertaste. And yet, something was wrong. The flavor lingered too long, not on the tongue, but in the throat. She drank water. It didn't clear. Another taster stepped forward, took his bite, and paused. "Not wrong," he said, "but strange." They logged it as irregular. That afternoon, the dish was quietly destroyed. No one claimed it. But the next day, the junior eunuch who delivered it was gone from his post, and the name of the cook was scratched off the kitchen wall chart. The tea that sang not. All suspicious meals ended in silence. There was a kind of jasmine tea brewed only in the western provinces, where the flowers were steeped fresh at midnight and infused with charcoal roasted salt. It hummed, some said, in the back of the throat. Lady Ming, one of the lesser-known but favoured concubines, requested it for her afternoon rest. Anli had never tasted it before. When the brew was prepared, she took a sip. It sang, not literally, but the warmth of it travelled through her spine like a thread being pulled. It was not poison, but it changed her breath. Later that night, she sat quietly in her quarters, unable to sleep. Something about the tea had loosened her thoughts. She remembered her old home, a pear tree in the courtyard, a girl named Juemi who used to steal dumplings from the kitchen. It was memory tea, harmless but powerful. And in the Forbidden City, memory was sometimes more dangerous than poison. The spoonful that ended a marriage. 1 week later, a visiting official from the Ministry of Rites presented a banquet gift to the Empress. Sweet black rice with caramelized winter melon. The Empress declined to eat it, as was custom, but the concubines sampled it during an evening gathering. Anli tasted the rice first. It was perfect, too perfect. Each grain glistened. The melon slices curved like shells. The syrup thick but clear. No common cook made food like this. She inquired softly to a kitchen maid. Where had it been prepared? Not in the palace. It had come from the minister's wife's private kitchen. The implication was immediate. It was not a gift of food. It was a gesture of favor or competition. The Empress ordered the dish removed. Not a scene, just a word. Enough. 2 weeks later, the official was demoted. His wife divorced, and Anli learned again. Tasting wasn't always about poison. Sometimes it was about power, measured in spoons. The plum wine with 2 histories. Each concubine had a favorite flavor. Some liked pickled plum, others drank bitter chrysanthemum, but none were as fond of plum wine as Consort Shu. She drank it warm, even in the spring, said it cleared her voice and softened her memory. One evening, a batch of plum wine arrived with a strange variation. Darker, color, richer scent. The bottle bore the palace seal, but the cork had been re-wrapped. Anli tasted it. 2 notes. One bright, fruity, sharp. The second deeper, smoke and vinegar. A trace of over-fermentation. Not enough to sicken, just enough to offend. She sent a message. The wine was withheld. Consort Shu never asked why. But she didn't request plum wine for 2 months after. That same week, an older eunuch retired early, and 3 names disappeared from the drink ledger. The taster's illness, it was bound to happen. One cold morning, after sampling a rice porridge with pine nuts and chrysanthemum petals, Anli began to sweat. Her stomach churned, her eyes blurred, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. She was escorted to her quarters, given medicinal tea, her bedding replaced, her name left on the roster. No replacement was assigned. She recovered in 3 days. No one asked what caused it. No one scolded the kitchen, but the porridge never appeared again, and the taste of chrysanthemum stayed in her throat for a week, like a warning that never raised its voice. The dinner without taste. Then one night, she tasted a meal so bland it frightened her. Steamed egg custard, braised cabbage, plain rice, no salt, no garnish, no scent. She tasted each bite, each one passed, but she felt nothing. The food had been stripped of all pleasure. It fed, but it did not live. She looked at the names on the order chart. Lady Anne, Lady Eugene, Noblewoman Wei. All known for discretion, all known for their neutrality and palace rivalries. The meal had not been made for joy. It had been made for control. Tasteless, food for women who were meant to disappear. That night, Anley wrote nothing in the tasting log. She left the page blank, as if to say, I cannot name what I felt, but I know it was done on purpose. And as she folded her hands beneath the oil lamp and stared at the ink drying on her sleeve, she asked herself just once, if my tongue forgets what flavor is, will I still know when something is wrong? There were smiles, and then there were court smiles. One moved the lips, the other moved empires. In the inner palace of Imperial China, to smile before the emperor was not a spontaneous act. It was a studied gesture, practiced, measured, tested by fire and perfected by silence. A concubine's future could hinge not on her words, but on the precise angle of her mouth. Too wide, she seemed forward. Too subtle, she lacked charm. Smiling at the wrong moment could end a career. Smiling at the right one could... Mei Ling stood in that room for hours over several days, studying herself. She discovered that when she smiled from the left, a dimple appeared that softened her whole expression. From the right, her cheek seemed too sharp. When she tilted her chin just slightly upward, she looked confident, but if she raised it too far, she seemed arrogant. None of this was vain. It was defensive, because the emperor remembered smiles more than names. The first glance. The first time a concubine was brought before the emperor in an informal setting, a poetry recitation, a tea ceremony, a stroll in the garden, she was instructed not to speak unless addressed. But the real test was visual. She was expected to bow, lower her gaze, and then, if appropriate, lift her eyes just slightly. Not directly to the emperor's, to his shoulder or his chin. A respectful near gaze, and then the smile. It had to be soft, receptive, present, but never too eager. That first glance was not about being noticed. It was about being safe to notice. If she performed well, she might be spoken to. If not, she would never be called again, and no one would explain why. The consort of the 100 Smiles legend spoke of a former consort, long before Mei Ling's time, who was known in the court as the consort of the 100 Smiles. She had risen from obscurity, it was said, not through family rank or stunning beauty, but through her ability to mirror whatever the emperor felt. When he was solemn, she smiled gently. When he was curious, she smiled as though pondering the same mystery. When he laughed, she laughed a moment later. Never first, never last. She did not speak much, but the emperor looked for her in every crowd. One day, she vanished. Some said she died of illness. Others said she laughed at the wrong time during a private recital and was removed that same evening. Either way, her technique lived on in whispers, and in every bronze mirror, her ghost smiled back. The smile that cost a promotion. Mei Ling remembered it clearly. It happened during the Plum Blossom Festival. She had been assigned to serve spiced tea in the outer pavilion. The emperor passed by with his attendants. She bowed, offered the cup, and smiled. Grateful, subtle, respectful. And then she saw it. Another concubine. Jinhe smiled too, but hers was brighter, wider, and the emperor turned his head. Just slightly, it was enough. Jinhe was called for garden duty 2 days later, and a week after that, she was promoted to talented woman, a fifth-rank court position. Mei Ling said nothing, but that night she stood in front of her own mirror and practiced for hours, not to copy Jinhe's smile, to soften her own, because the smile that drew attention also drew eyes, and not all of them were kind. The smile, with a purpose. Eventually, Mei Ling was taught the deeper rule. Smiles could be coded. There was the invitation smile, used during performances, dances, or ceremonial. Greetings, just enough suggestion to be remembered. There was the listening smile, used when the emperor recited poetry or shared a reflection. Slight curve, no teeth, eyes partially closed, and the shield smile, used when another woman tried to provoke her. This one was the hardest. It had to say, "I am not offended, I am not afraid, but I am also not weak." That smile, once mastered, saved Mei Ling from many confrontations, especially when Lady Xian accidentally stepped on her trailing sleeve, or when a tray of fruit was delivered to her quarters with a bruised peach in the center. The shield smile answered everything, without a word. The day she forgot to smile, it was bound to happen. A long day. No festival, no formal event, just routine tea service for a visiting noble. Mei Ling bowed, served, moved to the side, and forgot to smile. She realized it as she returned to her quarters. The absence hit her like a chill. She had presented a neutral face, not hostile, not cold, just blank. 3 days later, she was reassigned to robe inventory, not punished, but placed further from ceremonial duties. She smiled at everyone that evening, but it didn't matter, because a missing smile left no mark on the record, only on memory. And, in the court, memory shaped destiny. The smile. She gave herself one morning, with no tasks and no summons. Mei Ling stood before the bronze mirror again. No instruction, no script, just herself. She tried each smile in order: invitation, listening, shield. Then she tried something new. She let her face soften, let her jaw relax. Her lips curved not from discipline but from memory, of water in her childhood courtyard, of peach blossoms, of dumpling steam rising from a bamboo basket. She smiled, for herself, and it was unfamiliar, too open, too real. But in that moment, she remembered who she had been before she was watched, and for a breath, the palace felt just a little farther away. And as the smile faded, she whispered quietly into the silence, "If no one sees the smile you give yourself, does it still matter? Or has even joy become part of the performance?" In the high arches of the orchid pavilion, beneath silken lanterns and scrolls painted with mountains no one in the palace would ever visit, Mei Ling stood at her appointed post. She was not alone. The room brimmed with fragrance, footsteps, and women arranged like brush strokes, subtle, poised, still. Tonight was different. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't a festival. It was an inspection. The emperor would walk among them, not to select, not to praise, but to observe. A ritual of presence, a reminder that they were not forgotten, which meant the smiles had to be perfect. The preparation ritual all day, Mei Ling had been coached. Hold your hands like this. Your left eye curves more. Let the right side lead. Don't let your bottom lip quiver. Practice breathing through your nose. The senior maids fussed with sleeves. A eunuch gently adjusted her posture, pushing her shoulders back by just a finger's breadth. Another woman applied powder to the corner of her eyes, not to stand out, but to correct imbalance. No one told her what to say, because she would not be speaking. Her smile would be her entire offering. The walk of attention. The emperor entered. At dusk, robes trimmed with sable, face unreadable. Behind him came 2 advisors and a young court poet. A tray of oranges was carried silently, a ceremonial gesture for good fortune. The women bowed. The emperor began his circuit. He did not pause. That was the way of it. He simply passed by, eyes moving like lanterns over a field. Light, brief, and gone. When he neared Mei Ling, her breath slowed. She lifted her gaze just enough, not to his eyes, but toward his collarbone, and held her practiced expression, a smile of presence. Not seduction, not pride, something quieter. A smile that said, "I am aware that you are near. I am not frightened, but I have nothing to demand." He didn't stop, but his step hesitated, a ripple in the current. Then he moved on. Behind her, the older woman beside. Her inhaled sharply, jealousy, surprise, perhaps even recognition. But Mei Ling didn't react. She simply held her smile for 5 seconds longer, and then let it go. The aftermath. She returned to her quarters in silence. No message followed. No eunuch knocked on her door. But in the morning, her name was shifted. From 6th of 9th Hall to 3rd of 8th Hall. A single column's difference and a new assignment. Ceremonial assistant. Scroll preparation room. She was closer now. Closer to where the emperor read, where he received tribute, where music was selected and poems reviewed. She was not summoned, but she had been seen, and all she had done was smile. The women who laughed. Too early, Mei Ling had seen it happen before. A concubine named Liuya, bright and clever, once laughed during a poetry gathering, before the emperor finished his final line. Not loudly, not mockingly, just too soon. She was reassigned to needlework. Her laughter had not been judged unkind. It had been judged presumptuous. Another, Lady Fu, smiled too brightly during a lantern lighting ceremony. She was seen chatting afterward, unmasked in her relief. She was passed over for the spring procession. In the inner palace, a smile was not a gift. It was a transaction, and if offered too freely, it lost its value. The role of the court musician, among the most envied figures in the emperor's inner circle, was the chief court musician, a woman named Xiang Fei. She played the pipa with such precision that even the candlelight seemed to hold its breath. Her music was flawless, but what made her legendary was her smile. She only smiled when she played, and never otherwise. No matter who praised her, no matter how many gifts she received. Her lips never moved, except when the strings did. It created a mystery, a sense of distance, an illusion of intimacy that the emperor found captivating. It was said, until he didn't. She vanished after a rumor that she wrote a poem comparing him to the moon, and herself to a lantern forever trying to follow it. Whether the poem existed, no one knew, but her smile had spoken too clearly, and it had not been court-approved. The smile in the dark one evening, Mei Ling sat alone in the scroll room, dusting a long-forgotten calligraphy roll. The light was soft. Her fingers moved gently across the paper's edge. She wasn't thinking about ranks, or inspections, or invitations, and then something happened. She smiled. Not at anyone. Not for anyone. Just because the paper reminded her of home. And for a second, she forgot where she was. She caught herself, and the smile faded, but it left behind a warmth she carried with her for days. A forbidden smile. A real one. Seen by no one, but felt by her, and, as she stood before her bronze mirror that night, folding her robe with practiced hands, she asked, "If a smile can save you, and also destroy you, is silence the only safe expression left?" Even the palace birds learned not to sing too loudly. The sparrows that fluttered through the tiled courtyards chirped only in brief, tentative bursts. The cranes near the lotus pavilion dipped their heads in near-perpetual bows. And the women of the harem, surrounded by painted ceilings and perfect hedges, learned the most delicate art of all, smiling without ever showing their teeth. In the Forbidden City, restraint was a virtue, restraint wrapped in silk and powder and ritual. It was easy to forget that every look, every step, every slight curve of the lips was performance. But Mei Ling never forgot, because every day she wore her face like a mask, a mirror, a veil. The Garden of Glances in early spring, the emperor resumed his midday walks in the southern gardens. The court poet accompanied him, as did a rotating roster of favored women, some summoned, some merely allowed to be present along the paths. Mei Ling was not summoned, but she was allowed to walk. This was its own kind of test. She walked beneath the plum trees with her hands tucked inside her sleeves, her gaze lowered. She timed her turns, so her hem never brushed the gravel. And when she saw him, distant, robed in deep vermilion, a circle of silk trailing in his wake, she did not stop. She let her smile appear slowly, as though caught by the sunlight itself. She didn't look directly, just enough to let him know she had seen. And if he looked her way, and some said he did, she let the smile fade just as gently, as if she hadn't meant to smile at all. The ceremony of the night fans. Every new moon, the concubines participated in the fan offering, a minor but meaningful ritual where each woman presented a hand-painted fan to be placed in the emperor's personal collection. The fans varied in design, cranes in moonlight, bamboo in wind, blossoms half fallen from their stems. But the smile that accompanied the offering was more important than the brushwork. Each woman knelt, bowed, extended her arm with the fan held delicately between two fingers, and smiled, but not in joy, in gratitude. Gratitude for being permitted to give. Mei Ling painted her fan with a single chrysanthemum and a pale ink wash of water rippling below it. Her smile was soft, but inside she felt nothing, not because she was cold, but because there was no space left in her for real feeling. She had spent it all maintaining the performance. The girl who smiled at herself, there was a new girl, barely 16, assigned to the 8th hall. Her name was Yingmei. She was quick to laugh, always bowing too deeply, her slippers slightly too bright. One morning, Mei Ling caught her smiling into her own reflection in a polished teapot lid. Not testing, not practicing, just admiring, as if she didn't yet understand how dangerous beauty could be. Mei Ling watched for a moment, then moved on. 2 weeks later, Yingmei was called to serve tea at the edge of a literary gathering. She smiled too long when the emperor passed her cup. She wasn't punished, but she was never called again. Her slippers dimmed after that, her laughter too. Mei Ling knew the look, the slow realization that joy had no place here, not without permission. The visit from the Empress. The Empress did not visit often, but when she did, every concubine was expected to radiate loyalty. Mei Ling had never spoken directly to her, but she had seen her up close. Tall, composed, face lined with the stillness of someone who had not smiled freely in 20 years. When she passed by the hall of painted shells, Mei Ling bowed low. As instructed, she let a smile curve gently into her cheeks. The Empress stopped. Not for long, just a moment. Her eyes scanned Mei Ling's face, and then she moved on. That evening, Mei Ling received a gift, a roll of silk, pale lavender, undyed, unscented. A neutral gift. A message. You were seen. You were not wrong, but tread carefully. It was the most honest response Mei Ling had ever received. The dinner without faces. Once during a rainstorm, the palace lost several lanterns to wind. That night's dining was conducted under dim, flickering light, and in that strange half-darkness, something happened. The women relaxed, just a little. No one could fully see their expressions. No one could measure their smiles. Mei Ling chewed slowly. Her lips rested in their natural shape. Her eyes wandered toward the thunder in the distance, and for just a few minutes, the entire room became faceless, peaceful, until a servant tripped and the light returned, and all the faces, every single one, snapped back into shape. The spell was broken, and Mei Ling knew they had not dined together that night. They had performed dinner, the smile that went nowhere. There were moments still when she forgot, when a songbird's trill would remind her of her childhood, when the brush of silk on her wrist reminded her of her mother's hand, and she would smile, naturally, with no audience, and then stop, because she had trained herself not to feel pleasure without oversight, not to risk joy unless it could be measured. And, in that absence, her real smile began to disappear. It wasn't stolen, it was worn away, by repetition, by expectation, by duty. The reflection in the lantern on the last day of the month of quiet prayers, Mei Ling lit a single oil lamp in her chamber. She sat before the bronze mirror again and tried to smile. It came slowly, a flicker of memory, a shadow of shape. But it didn't reach her eyes. She held it anyway, watched it settle, and then whispered so only the mirror could hear. If my smile has become someone else's, do I still own my face? In the palace archives, tucked deep in, the quiet western wing, where only record keepers and dust have free passage, there exists a long, narrow scroll. It is unadorned. No colored tassels, no golden edge, just a single loop of faded silk, binding a column of names, titles, and dates, some crossed out, some half-written, others ending mid-stroke. They called it the Silent Scroll. It was not an official document. It was a ledger of absence, of women who entered the Forbidden City and never left, not by death, not by promotion, but by vanishing. The ink that faded. Too quickly, every concubine was entered into the palace register upon arrival, her age, province, family standing, and given court designation. But the register was only one record. The silent scroll was something different. It included names of women whose designations were erased too soon, names for whom no death record existed, names never assigned a new chamber after reassignment, names no longer spoken aloud, women whose fates were never officially documented. just removed. The woman in blue, who slept too long. Mealing heard the story first from an older laundry attendant. The tale was short and incomplete, like most things in the inner palace. A concubine, new, pale, soft-spoken, had been placed in the 9th hall 2 winters ago. She wore blue robes instead of grey by mistake. No one corrected her. She was quiet, diligent. Then one day, she overslept roll call, not by hours, by minutes. She was reported, not punished, just never seen again. Her bed was reassigned. Her robe was found washed and folded, placed neatly on a bench. Her slippers vanished. Her name had been Bao Qin, but no one used it now. On the silent scroll, she was listed as 10th of 9th Hall, reassigned, date unclear. A single note in red ink read, Bouguahe, not suitable. No further detail. The garden path with no end, another name, Su Lian, a talented poet, said to have once caught the emperor's attention with a verse about lanterns and wind. Then she was seen walking the path of petal stones alone after dusk, something forbidden without escort. A eunuch